بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, dear Dr. Umar. It's really our honor and pleasure to have you here in Germany, and we thank you very much for giving us this interview. I would like to introduce you shortly, just so that our viewers can know you better. You are an American Muslim born in Nebraska to a Protestant family, and it was then the autobiography of Malcolm X which inspired you to embrace Islam in 1970. Is that right? Yeah. And subsequently you altered your field of study from history and English literature to Arabic and Islamic studies, and your dissertation is on the origins of Islamic law, Malik's concept of amal in the light of the Maliki legal theory. After that, you taught at different universities in the United States and Canada, and then in Saudi Arabia at the King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. And also during the time in Jeddah, you were able to study with a number of traditional scholars. Then you returned to the United States in 2000 under the auspices of the Nawawi Foundation. And this, I have to say, was really a blessing for the Muslims, not only in America, but in Western countries in general, because among other things, you wrote some seminal articles, among them Islam and the Cultural Imperative and Living Islam with Purpose. And I personally benefited very much from these articles, and I also teach them to my students. You first came to our attention with your CD series. You produced a CD series on famous women in Islam, and in it you portrayed women from Islamic history, most of whom have faded from memory and others virtually unknown to modern Muslims. So the question is, what prompted you to investigate these female figures, and could your interest have been sparked by the strong women in your own family? So we learned that your mother worked as a university lecturer in English at the university, which was surely quite a rare position for women at that time.
I think that that's true, that in my own life, God blessed me to be surrounded by many very intelligent and very gifted and very strong women of many generations. So, for example, one of the women who stands out is my great-grandmother, and she had been born the year that Lincoln was shot in 1865, and she came west on a covered wagon, and she taught school in Kansas, and she was elected to public office. She's, I think, one of the first women in Kansas to be elected to public office. And those women, my grandmothers, my mothers, my aunts, my mother, my aunts, these people were a very important part of my life. And I think that women always have to be a fundamental part of our lives. We receive our humanity in many ways from our mothers more than we do from anything else. And for this reason, if the woman is neglected and deprived and is not allowed to flourish and to grow, this has got to affect her children. And men are also, of course, extremely important. In my own case, I would say the men provided the finishing touches, but the women did all the work, and they were the great role models and the great examples, and they were the people that I wanted to please more than the men. This is just the way that it was, that your attachment to them is very strong, and you want to live up to the goals that they give you, and you want to please them. But a society in which women are not empowered and are not as actively involved in men has been compared by some contemporary Muslim scholars to a human being who has only one lung, or we could say who has only one kidney. And although we could say they can still function, but they can't function dynamically, and always their life is in danger. So in traditional Islamic societies, women had very important positions And I wanted to make that clear. And often the approach of the scholars that I had seen was that they talk about this from the standpoint of fiqh. And of course fiqh is very important, and fiqh is also very broad. And yet I felt that this is essentially a cultural issue. And I felt in coming back to the United States, when I first came back, one of my legal teachers told me that understand that any problem that you face in America is not a problem with the law, because Islamic law is broad and it can solve all of your problems. So don't ever regard law to be an obstacle. But when I first came back, I felt that essentially what we had to do was to teach the law, to work with the law. And then I came to see that really the issue is cultural. That the law is very important, but this is not our problem. Unless we want to say that people are interpreting the law in such a way that it becomes culturally predatory. But really the thing is, how do we relate to this culture? How do we live in this culture? And so I felt that in the case of women, instead of going through the fiqh on women, which is also controversial, just give people examples of these great women in Islamic history. And the examples that I gave are very few from very many. That must be emphasized. There are thousands of women like this. And in fact, I don't believe any civilization can offer as many examples of powerful women in all walks of life. Political, economic, poetry, literature, spirituality, religious knowledge, and so forth, as we can. And I also wanted to try to avoid focusing on the women companions, the sahabiyat. And that's because often when we talk about great women in Islam, people who do that, they talk about the great companion women, who are great. These are the mothers of the believers, in the case of the Prophet's wives, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course we love all these great women. And they were truly great women. And I do talk about some of them. But I wanted to show that there was a continuity after that of great women in different periods. Remarkable women. And this goes up into the modern period, in fact. And I felt that giving people role models is something hopefully not controversial. Because these are historical figures, this is a historical lesson. But also it shows you about that Islamic society that was created by Islamic law and created by Islamic theology that most Muslims today are totally unaware of. And that's very valuable. We're talking about women now, but we could also talk about things like city planning. That what was a Muslim city like? What were the animals like in that city? How did they deal with things like water and food? Because these are extremely instructive examples and things that most of us know nothing about today. So
we have a false impression of our history.
So I must say also that I know very little about this topic. And I simply knew that there were great women in our history. And to prepare these classes, I think we taught this at least 3 or 4 times in Chicago. I rushed through these books and I read everything very quickly and I took now notes. And therefore, I do feel that this is just a small beginning. And I've told some of the great women with whom I have the honor to work, like Dr. Muna Al-Hassan, whom I think extremely highly of, Maryam Shaybani, who's about to get her PhD from the University of Chicago, and others, that we need to work on this again. We need to redo this so that it has greater depth, it has greater breadth.
You mentioned the importance of culture, and and you stress the constructive relation of religion and culture. And gender relations and code of conducts between sexes are an important part of culture, in every culture. So how can Muslims in the Western world succeed in fitting into American or German culture on the one, without transgressing the boundaries of Islam on the one side, and without building up a counter culture that just rests on the total segregation of sexes on the other side?
I think in countries perhaps like Germany, I don't know enough about your country, and I came here to learn, not to teach really. And in my country, the United States, and in Canada, when we talk about the public sphere, then Muslim women are dynamically involved. So it's not something we need to do, it's something that's in fact done. And in the United States, we find Muslim women in all levels of society, in education, in business, in politics, and in other things. And perhaps, our greatest problem in the United States is the mosque itself, and perhaps the Islamic schools, because this is often where many people feel unwelcomed, and this should not be the case. The mosque should be the most welcoming of all spaces, and it should be the safest of all spaces. And this is part of our tradition, but often there are certain ways, these are things that can be explained, that there are certain ideologies, for example, that tend to dominate in our mosques and in our schools. And unfortunately, these tend to be very rigid, and there is a lot of misogyny. And last summer, when I was in Turkey, in the Rihla, some women brought up a whole number of questions that they had about Islam and about gender. And we had some very brilliant women that were there. And so I decided that we'd talk about this among ourselves and then speak to the students. And these women who are from Australia and from the United States and elsewhere, they are very committed Muslim women, like you yourselves are. And they're very serious about this religion, but they also made it very clear that when we talk about our situation today, especially in our quote-unquote religious circles, we have to acknowledge the misogyny that is there. And that men, in many cases, are simply not accommodated. And in fact, one of the things that is happening in Western countries, here in Germany, I do believe, you're an example of that, and then also in the United States, is that we are producing women scholars. And the sociology of the country is going to continue to do that, because here women have the ability to study and to learn, and they're going to do that. And given the nature of the culture of Muslims in the United States, because of the orientation of our culture towards things like medicine and engineering and law and high-paying professions, most Muslim families don't want their sons to go into Islamic studies. This is especially true of the United States, because they're not likely to make very much money. It shows you where our hearts are. We're fundamentally interested in how much money you make. This is a disaster. But they will allow women to do that much more often. And also, it is remarkable that in my experience in teaching men and women over many, many years, that women are often the best students. When I taught in Jeddah, I taught women and men, and the women were always the best. In the United States, this is often the case also, that the women are the best students. So we have many women coming up through our schools who are very, very capable. And this Dr. Muna Al-Hassan that I mentioned, she said, I hope we are not preparing them for disappointment.
The women.
Yes,
Yeah.
because she said they will learn
Yeah.
and they will master this knowledge. But who will listen to them?
That's the problem. So how would you
Who will
get
give them a
people to
place
listen?
to speak?
Yeah.
And this is a huge problem. Again, one of the things that we have to be conscious of is that time changes and the generations change. And so therefore, these mosques are not static, and after a while, the old guard must pass, and new people will come. Sometimes those new people are disappointing to me, but in many cases they're not. In many cases, they understand what their parents or grandparents may not have understood. And we see in Chicago, for example, some very good mosques and Islamic schools that were very difficult to work with just a few years ago, which have now opened up, and they have new administrations. And so hopefully also as time goes by, we will begin to understand things better than we do today. But my attitude towards this is that in the very limited scope of influence that people like me have, that at least in our circles, we have got to establish the right norms. And I myself am very interested in working with Muslim women scholars, that I'm very happy to contribute to them anything I can, and I'm always very interested to learn from them. And again, I've mentioned this one particular scholar whom I think very highly of, and we work closely together. I hope that we will continue to work even more closely together. But I've taken part now in a few conferences and a few educational retreats where she was there. And one of the things you can see, at least that I feel that I can see, is that the female perspective that she gives is so important for us as men and so important for the women. And this is one of the reasons why in Islam, women must be scholars just like men. This is an obligation. It is not something that today we are interested in because of the imperatives of pluralism in our societies. In Islamic law, it is fard kifaya. It is a societal obligation that we produce women scholars in every field of Islamic religion and law, just as we produce men. And it is not acceptable that scholars be a gender-specific profession for men. This is not Islam. And so hopefully we will be able to change this. And hopefully the sociology of our Western countries will enable us to get this started in a good way. You have so many women studying here. We have women studying in the United States. But I could tell you that a number of retreats in the English-speaking world in which you have men and women participating together, the women are always the majority who apply. They are the most qualified who apply. And when we bring in the men, who might usually be less than 50%, we have to lower the standards in order to get the number up. So there's a lot of potential there. And we have got to give women the voice. When we have this misogyny in our community that will not allow women to speak, then you are going to create a disaster. There will be women, of course, who just leave the religion and they go about their lives the way they want to do. They are welcomed in this society, They're welcomed in American society. There's no problem there. So they can go about their lives. But there are other women who will not do that. They will retaliate. And we have an organization in North America called FITNA, F-I-T-N-A. It is Feminist Islamic Troublemakers of North America.
I didn't hear about that.
Troublemakers. Like, and this is what they've been told. They've been told since they were little girls that you're a fitna.
You're a fitna.
So they said, okay, we will create an organization called fitna. You know, the troublemakers, feminist Islamic troublemakers of North America.
So they took this
And God guide them, and God bless them. And we have other groups as well. And we have other movements afoot in the United States.
So you see these movements as a consequence.
And the thing is, who produced this?
Yes.
I'm not going to say that that is bad, by the way, because I don't want to make that kind of a generalization about them, because generally speaking, the women are sincere, and they want to take part in this religion, and they want to have a voice. But we are the ones who produce that, because when you create a situation where the woman is simply not welcome, you know, there are mosques, you know, where the women have no place to pray at all. And if a woman goes there, she might be put in the broom closet in a beautiful mosque, you know, where she prays next to, you know, the chemicals they use to sanitize the mosque. What is that? And this rejection of women and this disallowance of women to be able to take part in our communities is a disaster. In Canada, for example, we have many more mosques numerically than in the United States, where women are simply not allowed. That's very unfortunate. And I love the Canadian community, and I believe that the Canadian community is one of the vanguards in the Western world. But in some cases, a woman simply will not be allowed in that mosque. I know of a case of a woman who wanted to pray her afternoon prayers on an extremely cold day in a Canadian city. There was a blizzard, snow outside, it was very cold, and she came and knocked on the door and she said, "Please, could I come in to pray?" And the custodian of the mosque said, "Absolutely not." And he treated her as if she were a demon. And fortunately, this woman told him, "Get out of the way." And she came into the mosque and she performed her ablutions and she prayed. And then she went about her business. And I respect that very much. You know, because these people are destroying our religion. And they have no, it's as if they have no consciousness whatsoever of what they are producing. What will be the outcome of that? And of course, women are an issue. And we have to keep women in the religion. And we have to give them their rights. And we have to take guidance from them. And the feminine perspective is always one that adds things that the masculine perspective is not going to do. This is why the woman scholar is so important. And hopefully we will see more of that. But in addition to that, you have the issue of the young generation and of many people who are maybe not even in the young generation, but you know, faced by the things that are in the media on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, and seeing then their own communities be incapable of understanding or of empathy or of any kind of proactive work, they simply begin to leave the religion. And this is a big problem that we face. And again, we have to make our communities open and welcoming. And Islam is not meant to be judgmental. Islam has judgments, yes. And we have judgments about what is good and what is bad and what is obligatory and what is not. But I don't use those judgments to judge other people and condemn them. We have to welcome them and we have to guide them and we have to open the doors for them. And, you know, may we be successful with that.
This relates to the next question.
Yes, I thought about the same. I would like to talk about another topic which is actually not, or which Muslim people in Germany don't like to talk about. It's the headscarf, because the non-Muslim society is always talking about it in a special way. But you are pointing an interesting aspect, and you're saying you're talking about the danger of, quote, women's covering becoming an issue of identity, an issue of highly politicized agenda, unquote, especially by mixing up moral judgments and legal judgments. This relates to the last thing you said. And an interesting part in this interview, telling to work around such inscriptions, he suggests generating our own distinctive cognitive frames. And yeah, could you elaborate on this issue and on your suggestion?
This is a point that has been made by a number of scholars, that during the colonial period, those countries like Egypt that came under powerful colonial influence, they faced this influence that came from the colonial powers to try to uncover their women. And the Western powers, one of the things that bothered them more than anything else is that they couldn't see our women, that our women were uncovered, that our women were covered, and they wanted our women to be uncovered. And of course, this struck a nerve in the Muslim society that was very painful. And for that reason, the nationalist movements, as well as Islamic movements, they often focused on the issue of women's dress. And they made that one of the rallying points. And in doing that, whether they intended to do that or not, they turn the woman's dress into a symbol. And it becomes a symbol of nationalism. It becomes a symbol of identity. It becomes a symbol also of our stand against the West and our assertion of our own independent reality. And so I think that we need to unpack that, because of the fact that in Islamic law, although the woman's dress is very important and the man's dress is very important, and we have codes of dress that pertain to men and women, but in traditional Islamic law, you will have to search through the books to actually find discussion of these things. And you'll find them in places like the covering of the body in prayer. And you'll find them in places like the dress we wear in pilgrimage. But there is no chapter that is specifically designated to hijab or to the woman's scarf or anything like that. It was, of course, a part of the law. It was also a part of the culture. But these were items of dress. They were not cultural symbols. And there's also another thing here to be mentioned, which is perhaps awkward to talk about today. And that's the fact that pre-modern societies were societies that had slavery. This was true in the West, and this was true in the Muslim world and elsewhere as well. And the dress code for slave women was not the same. In fact, in Islamic law, the way that most Muslim scholars understood the headscarf and things related to that was that it was meant to distinguish the free woman from the non-free. And this was to also ensure the dignity of the free woman. Of course, the non-free woman should also have her dignity, but she had a different social economic class. And she also had much more liberality in the way that she dressed and in the way that she worked and so forth. In fact, in Islamic history, there is a sort of rivalry that some scholars have talked about between the free woman and between the slave woman, because the slave woman often becomes extremely powerful. And she may also become extremely influential. And often she had the ability to move about in society among men in a way that the free woman wouldn't have. And there are Muslims who wrote about this very early. Al-Jahidh is one of the examples of that. And Al-Jahidh, by the way, writes about, who's an Abbasid literary figure, very intelligent, very insightful. He has very, very penetrating things to say about misogyny and about the rights of women and so forth. But one of the things he noticed is that there was a naturalness and an openness to gender relations in the society of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the companions, and during the rightly guided caliphate, and then into the Umayyad period, which was very different than the norms that began to be established in the Abbasid period. And the idea of the seclusion of women, the total seclusion of women, in what is called in Persian purda, or what could be called the harim or the harem from Arabic. These are cultural conventions that the Muslims took over, not from the Prophet ﷺ, but they took them over from the Persians, and they took them over from the Greeks, the Byzantines. The Byzantines had that kind of division, and this is then taken over by Muslims, especially in eastern parts of the world. There are some Muslim societies, or cultures like those of the Bedouins, in many cases, that tend to preserve a more natural relationship between genders. In countries like Mauritania, for example, women tend to still be very dynamic. And in Bedouin cultures, even in Arabia, the Arabian Bedouin woman is definitely the equal counterpart of the male. And, they, even if women are not allowed to drive, in Arabia, the Bedouin women do drive. And they drive across the desert in their pickup trucks, and they carry armed weapons, by the way. If they go out to take care of the sheep, they also have weapons in case someone would want to bother them. So there are a lot of exceptions to these things as well, but this is something very important for us to study carefully and objectively. And in all things, it is our responsibility as people who love knowledge and who seek knowledge that we try to diffuse these issues so that we can talk about them calmly and we can weigh the facts and we don't have a fight immediately. And this is also where the misogyny is such a big problem, because when that misogyny reigns, as it does in some cultures and in some groups, there's nothing you can say. You cannot even raise this issue. And this is a critical issue that does have to be raised. But how we go about working with it, we need different strategies. And no doubt the strategies that you can come up, will be ones we benefit from. As I said before, in my own very limited frame of influence, I just feel that the people that we work with, let's set the right example there.
Okay, I would like to relate to the parts of the man you were talking about a little bit, because in the interview about hijab and headscarf, you talked about the importance of Muslim men who should gain more visibility as Muslims and take share in publicly representing Islam next to women. So how would you describe an ideal Muslim manhood in the light of our current situation in our Muslim communities? And how do we educate our young and old male members of the Muslim community towards these ideals?
I think this is an ideal, and I made this statement because of the fact that in the wake of 9/11, I noticed in my country that the women who received the negative attention were our sisters who were wearing scarves. And I developed a very strong respect for those sisters because this is difficult. And you're courageous, but some of them, maybe it's too courageous for them because they don't want that kind of confrontation. And so I felt, first of all, that I wish people would know that I'm a Muslim too. So that if you have an issue with my sister, you can also have an issue with me, because maybe I can deal with this in a way that's different from the way she deals with it. And that's the context in which I made that statement. And I do believe that dress is an extremely important thing. And when we talk about art in Islam, which is an extremely valuable topic, one of the first focuses of Islamic art was dress. And we created beautiful types of dress for men and women. Dress that enabled us to make wudu. Dress that enabled us to pray in a dignified way. Sometimes we see these photographs of a great Eid prayer, let's say in a country like Ghana or West Africa, and a West African country like Nigeria, and the people are wearing traditional dress. And even when they make prostration, it looks extremely dignified. And when men in particular are making prostration in Western clothing, you would like them to turn off the camera. Because that's not dignified. And that's why, although we have great latitude in the type of dress that we want, but Muslims always wanted dress that enabled them to make wudu, that enabled them to pray easily, because this is something very important for us, and enabled them to look beautiful at the same time. And that also gave them a cultural identity. And of course, in traditional societies, everyone dresses in a way that identifies who they are. When I first came to Germany in 1963, I went to the Black Forest, and many of the villages, they all wore traditional Schwarzwald dress. And there might be differences from one village to another, but just by looking at the man or looking at the women, you would know who they are, what their ethnicity is, and there are all sorts of other things that you might know as well from the way they dress. And that's the way traditional people were. And that's because traditional people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, whoever, they identified with primary groups. And they wanted those primary groups, their families, their communes, their orders, and whatever, to be known. And they had solidarity with their group. And so this affected their dress. And in modern society, one of the important developments is the breakup of primary groups. And this happens with technological advance, the creation of the mass society, and the ideology of individualism, and then the propagation of individualism, which makes it easy to direct the mass society. We would think that individualism gives us greater freedom. Indeed, it does give us greater freedom in some things, but ultimately it endangers other freedoms in society that were protected by primary groups. So in traditional societies, it was very natural that every primary group would have a type of dress that identified them. And of course, we don't have to go back very far in history where we will see Christian women dressing very similarly to the way that you're dressed right now. And even when I was a boy, women did not go into church with their heads uncovered. And they wore beautiful hats. In fact, they competed with each other in the beautiful hats they wore. And often those women veiled their faces behind their hats with a see-through veil. Might be white or black or red or another color. And I think that one of the issues that we face here is the issue of secular intolerance.
Yeah.
And this is something that's very typical of the secular society, because in creating the mass society, breaking down the primary groups, it does have an ideology. And that ideology also has various forms of propaganda. And it seeks to have a society that sort of levels out the different groups at the level of the individual. And I think this is one of the reasons why the dress of the woman has become problematic, the Muslim woman, simply because it is a throwback to a way of dress that was common in these societies before, but which moderns don't really know how to deal with. And I think that for men, it's important for us, and for women also, to develop very beautiful types of dress. And of course, the way people dress will reflect the attitudes they have. A lot of our young people, they don't want to dress in an elegant way. They want to dress in a way that is very similar to their peers who wear their jeans with holes in them and things like that. And of course, we have to allow for a lot of cultural expression and freedom. But at the same time, it's important that we develop types of dress, which again, I would say are artistic and beautiful. And I feel that the women, maybe in this regard, often do better than the men. Some of our Muslim women have very beautiful wardrobes, and wardrobes that are extremely respectable in Western society. And with men, some of us who want to express our Islamic identity by wearing a turban or a particular type of hat or a thawb, a long garment, sometimes I would wish that they wouldn't do that, because they do it in such a sloppy way, and they do it in such an unrefined way that they don't give themselves any dignity at all. And of course, also, when we indicate our distinct identity by the way that we dress, we have to understand that this is so we can be ambassadors. And this is why always we have to understand that the most important issue is not conformity to outward norms, even though this is important for us, but it's not everything for us, but it is the way we behave. And here, no matter how we behave, if we behave with dignity, then that says a great deal for us in society. For example, men or young men may find themselves in situations where women are being discussed in an offensive way. And if that man refuses to take part in that, even if it's silence, or even if maybe he objects in some way, or he has another opinion, that is extremely effective. These are the kind of things that we want, and we have to live the life of good Muslims, and Muslims must be good neighbors. But I feel myself that we still need to develop forms of dress that mesh with this society, that are naturally acceptable to this society, but that have all the elements that we want of dignity, of grace, of beauty, and the man should cover his head. In traditional Islamic law, this was emphasized very strongly. And in fact, a man who didn't cover his head properly would not be regarded to be a good person. And his witness would not be accepted in a court of law. And there were exceptions made to that, because in Muslim Spain, the Berbers covered their head in one way, which was with turbans, and the Arabs tended to cover their heads in another way, and the Andalusian Muslims in general, many of whom were the speakers of Romance languages, they often didn't cover their heads at all. That was their norm. The men, speaking about the men. And for that reason, the Maliki jurists of Spain and Portugal made an exception in that case. And they said that if it is an Andalusian Muslim, and he doesn't cover his head, we will not regard that to be an indication of moral corruption. But generally in the Muslim world it was. And how do men cover their head? I've told some of my friends that let's hire really talented designers to give us headpieces, because usually I don't find something that I'm comfortable with. I would like to cover my head also in a way that indicates that I'm a Muslim, but I want it to look nice, and I want it also not to clash with the society that I'm in.
So just one question, because I asked about how we can educate young and old men about this, towards this ideal of manhood. So would you say, like, talking about this issue, because in my opinion, Muslim men don't think about dress like Muslim women do. I mean, they just take something, and I don't know. I have the impression that they don't know what part or how important it is, as you just explained. So, would you say we should talk more about that issue, like you have done with young men and older men, that they know they have to be careful about their appearance? Can I add something? Because on the other hand, in the culture we have something like the hipsters culture. So it's I don't know if it's too much, like the importance of dress and so.
It's also sometimes
dangerous
to concentrate so much on the outer.
Yes. So this is the question about how we deal with this cultural frame and what you have said. So.
Informality is part of modern culture, and it's part of the individualism of the culture, and also some of these principles like grace and dignity and beauty are problematic in the modern setting. So this is also part of what is at stake. And if you look at the way that people dress on airplanes today, they would have never dressed like that on airplanes just a few decades ago. And, this also reflects the fact that our commitment to these higher values is something that reflects our commitment to religion, per se, and the notion of a hierarchy in creation. And this is not part of the ideology of secularism. And, so I think that we don't want to focus too much on the outward form. I do think, though, that it's important that, Muslims get back the sense of being respectable. And especially, in our societies here in the West, that if we do stand out, we want to stand out in a beautiful way, and not in a way that's offensive. And I think that we need to have that brought to our attention. In the traditional Islamic world, that was something very, very important, that you dress in a dignified way. And scholars in particular were expected to dress in a very dignified way. And a lot of our youth, we are going to make a cultural statement by the way that we dress. Maybe that cultural statement is, I don't care. And it seems to be that is the way that a lot of our men are expressing themselves, whether they know that or not. But that's not good, because you should care. And also you care so much about your wife or your daughter or your sister. And you will see Muslim men in our societies, and sometimes coming from abroad, who have their women dressed to the teeth and completely covered. And the man himself is wearing a t-shirt and Bermuda shorts and sandals. And the way he looks means nothing to him. And he doesn't see the glaring contradiction, which the Westerners are going to see, that look at you. And no one would know who you are, or where you come from, or whether you're a Muslim or not. But your women have to dress this way. And maybe the weather's very hot, and you're cool, and they're sweating. You know, so we need to wake up to these contradictions, and we need to also be more fair in the way that we treat each other and the way that we dress. A lot of our youth, a lot of the youth that we have who are not very tolerant and who may be rigid and fanatical, they still dress with baseball caps that they turn around, and they have jeans which are maybe cut off at the thigh, and they have sort of a hipster type look. A lot of them do come out of gangs, by the way, and they still sort of dress the way that they did before. And that's a cultural statement, but it is a statement also that I don't belong to your culture. And sometimes they make that statement because they've never been allowed to belong. And this is another issue that we have to talk about very frankly, because if the dominant culture is not going to accept us, then we expect people in our community to respond by saying, then I'll do my thing, my way. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but again, we want to be beautiful and dignified, and we want to embody the worldview that we believe in the way that we dress. And I believe very strongly that Muslims must be vanguards, and rarely are we that today. As a matter of fact, in many cases, if we talk about what some people call the caravan of civilization, we are not at the back of the caravan. We are way behind the caravan, trying to catch up. This is an extremely unfortunate situation, and of course it has a lot of explanations that deal with racism and nationalism, ethno-nationalism, the colonial experience of the Muslim world, the lack of self-esteem that some Muslims have, others don't have that, but some do have that. And that lack of self-esteem also reflects in the way they dress, and in the way they act, in the way they treat women, and other things. It's very important for us to set good examples. And this is where people like educated and educating women and educated and educating men, they need also to set examples. That we want our women and our men to be able to communicate with all social levels. And I would like to see them ultimately also have something to contribute at all levels. And intellectually, we can do that. Our tradition is metaphysically profound, scientifically profound, theologically and morally and ethically profound. And we have to bring that back to life in ourselves. And then we have to be adequate ambassadors of that in our society, in our societies.
Yeah, I think we just take one last question.
Really?
And look to the we should. Perhaps just one. You already mentioned something, but just one piece of advice to women. I mean, we are also witnessing the withdrawal of many Muslim women from their communities. So what should they do in order not to despair or just or in the worst case to leave Islam?
What should the women do? That's a very good question, and I wish I had a very good answer for you. But I would like to say that maybe we might start with another question, which is what should we do? Because you do represent leadership in the community, and therefore those of us who represent leadership in the community, you have to reach out and you have to communicate, and we have to invite people, and we have to create safe spaces. And we have organizations that do that in the United States. In Germany, I know that you have people who are striving to do that as well. And we have to invite the people who are uninvited. And we have to also have great empathy with them and great sympathy for them. Sometimes we have scandals in our community. And unfortunately, in the English-speaking world and in Pakistan and elsewhere, we have had, in these last 2 years, a number of scandals, horrendous scandals, involving male teachers and sometimes male sheikhs, who are teachers but also supposed to be spiritual guides. And of course, when that happens, the fallout is unexpectedly great, because many people will just give up on the religion altogether. And the mistake the scholar makes, he's not the only one who stumbles. The whole society may stumble because of him. That's true of us, and it's true of all people. And therefore, what do you say about a person who, because the guides that they relied on have been shown to be unworthy of their trust, now have no trust in the faith? And my belief is that you must excuse them. I would say the first crime of that teacher was that he made them dependent on him, and not dependent on God, and not dependent on the richness of the faith that comes with the knowledge of God. But we say in our tradition that the faith of the common man and the common woman is in their eyes. It's in what they see. And it might be in the scholar's turban, or in his beautiful dress, or his shawl, or something like that, which is absurd. Those are nothing but exterior symbols. But common people are like that. People will think that someone is a great sheikh because he has a beard. So our people, the common people everywhere, they're capable of great superficiality. But this is also why, when you have scholars that are worthy of their trust, then that's a mercy to them. And this is the way all scholars should be, men and women. But when the scholar betrays them, then they are in a disastrous situation. And this is repeated over and over again in the Muslim world. Who do we have to look up to today? And of course, we can answer that question. There are many men and women that we have to look up to in every Muslim country. But nevertheless, there's so many that prove themselves unworthy of our trust. And this is a disaster. And so for us, what we have to pray for is that God protect us from that, and that we may be worthy of the trust. And we may be people who are dependable, that can show the integrity that this religion has to have, and help people renew their faith, and welcome people home.
It's a very beautiful last point to make. Inshallah. Thank you very much for your time.
It was a great conversation.
Hopefully you come back to Germany also when the weather is better.
This weather is not bad.
Ya Rahmanu Ya Rahim Ya Rahman